We love all of our children, so to speak. But today I'm going to start to talk at the Broadway Golden Age, starting in 1950. Now, there's some intellectual scholars who will tell you the Golden Age started in 1943 with Oklahoma. We could argue that, yes or no. I think I'm still a little loud. I get some yes, some no. Okay. So what I'm going to do is say, for our point of discussion, let's say it really starts at the end of 1949 and goes all the way to 1969, which is 20 hefty years of musical theater entertainment. Again, I love starting with pictures of what Times Square looked like, and if any of you haven't been to Times Square in about 50 years, it no longer has traffic going in these directions. This is a picture looking north on Broadway. The Astor Hotel is no longer there. The Chevrolet sign is no longer there. And there's absolutely nothing in this picture that exists, including the traffic pattern. On the left-hand side is now a pedestrian mall. And if you're really lucky, you may be able to pay one of the Huskers for a nude photograph. You know that they, anyway. So, why was this the Golden Age? Well, first of all, the book and the musical. And when I refer to the book, that's the script. They were now totally integrated so that when the lyrics were sung and the story was being told, what the characters were singing was truly part of what this story was about. The characters sang this music that told their characters, and if you turned on the radio, all of the top 40 hits, or a large portion of them, were associated with Broadway musicals still. There was invention in storytelling, and integrated dance that was now called choreography was a part of the Broadway musical. Now we have the old guard who is still composing. In the upper left, this is that's Cole Porter. He writes two musicals in the 1950s, both which were chastised at the time. One created a phenomenal song after they told him he no longer could write. I guess you all have heard the song, I Love Paris in the Springtime. And there's another one that he wrote for that show, Can Can. When love comes in and takes you for a spin, ooh la la la, say magnifico. Aren't those terrible songs? And they told him he could no longer write. In the upper middle is Julie Stein, who had just written Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. In the upper right next to him is Irving Berlin. Below Irving Berlin is Kurt Weill, who dies shortly after the 1950s begin. And then to the left is Harold Rome. But now we have this emerging group. In the upper left corner is Frank Lesser. He is the son of a very, very established classical musical family who looked down on him as a two-bit songwriting hack, his brother being a world-renowned concert pianist. And he has written lots of music for Hollywood. He has just won an Academy Award for a song called Baby, It's Cold Outside. And he is going to write Guys and Dolls, and his family looks down upon him for the reasons I just shared. Above them to the right is Lerner and Lowe. The top right is Leonard Bernstein and Stephen Sondheim on the opening night of West Side Story. Below Steve and Lenny is Meredith Willson. To the left of Meredith is Rodgers and Hammerstein, who have a very challenging time, believe it or not, during the 1950s. We have Adler and Ross and Bach and Harnick. The choreographers become extremely important in this time period. Bob Fosse, top right, begins his career. Agnes DeMille to the left, far left Michael Kidd, far right Gower Champion, and the guy in the center is one of the most hideous human beings to populate the Broadway community for the next 15 years, and that is Jerome Robbins. Jerome Robbins was a very egotistical, self-centered, all-about-me kind of a guy. He had very left-wing thought processes and was very involved with the Communist Party and rallies during his youth. Ed Sullivan, who is an informant to the FBI for people in the Broadway community who had ties to the Communist Party, goes to Jerome Robbins about 1951 and says, either you go before the committee and name names, or I'm going to tell the world about the affair you're having with Montgomery Clift. So Jerome Robbins, sort of thinking more about his career than anything else, decides, okay, I will go before the committee and name names. Two of the names that he names are Zero Mostel and Jack Guilford, which ends the career of Zero Mostel for 9 years, and he becomes a house painter. Jerome Robbins also, in the way he manipulates the business, starts a trend that's really very important for choreographers at this point in time. He writes things into the script that must be done in any professional production that is associated with him. And to this day, if you go to see a great number of productions by these renowned choreographers, it says, based upon the choreography of, and their estates get a residual for that. So Jerome Robbins started this, but he started it in secrecy when his creative partners knew nothing about it. And when I get to West Side Story, I'll explain a little more about that. So keep in mind, Jerome Robbins, one hideous guy. We have emerging talent. In the upper left, we have Julie Newmar. Remember, she was Catwoman, I think. And she was Stupefying Jones and Lil Abner. To the right of her is Florence Henderson. You remember Mrs. Brady? And she begins her career in a musical called Fanny. At the upper right is Phil Silvers, who was an MGM comic player going back and forth. He begins a Broadway career in a musical called Top Banana based upon Sid Caesar, and he goes on to a television career after that. The bottom left is Dick Van Dyke and Cheetah Rivera. To the bottom right is Gwen Verdon, and in the center is Julie Andrews' headshot for her My Fair Lady audition. She was all of, I think, 22. The upper left, Carol Burnett, has a Broadway career in the late 50s. Carol Channing below her, Robert Preston and Barbara Cook. Above that is Elaine Stritch. To the right of that is Don Knotts. Below that, Andy Griffith. And of course, we all know who's left. That's Yul Brynner, or the King of Siam, however you wish to remember him. But we had carryover talent. To the left is Celeste Holm. In the middle is Gertrude Lawrence, and they're somewhat connected here, which we'll get into in a minute. Rosalind Russell and Edie Adams. In the upper right is Ethel Merman and Irving Berlin. To the left of them is Alfred Drake and Judy Holliday to the left of Alfred Drake. So storylines have really evolved by this point in time. We can make a musical about anything. We could make a musical about racism with South Pacific, The King and I, for example. We could make political satire with musicals such as Call Me Madam. We could do musicals based upon, I can't read this from there, so I've got to read it from here. Hold on one second. Coming up. Musicals where they didn't have love stories, like The King and I, My Fair Lady. We could have musicals based upon labor relations with The Pajama Game. We could have musicals with operatic tones, such as Candide and West Side Story. Famous people by the end of the 1950s could become the topic of a musical. Gypsy Rose Lee, Maria von Trapp, Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia, to name a few. And then we had cultural phenomena like Guys and Dolls and Lil Abner, Elvis Presley, and a few others. But this is the great gift of the 1950s. Do any of you own any of these? All of them, well, maybe all but one. The recording of the Broadway cast was what we took home. This is what we listened to. And the biggest selling recording of all time was this one. But let me tell you the story of this one. Ethel Merman, when she appears in Call Me Madam, she's under contract to Decca Records, and Decca is not going to record Call Me Madam, so she refuses to record it for two reasons. One, she doesn't want to violate her contract, and two, she doesn't sing the hit songs that are on the radio from Call Me Madam, and everybody knows if Ethel Merman's in it, it has to be her that sings the song if it's a hit. The most famous song from Call Me Madam was a song called It's a Lovely Day Today, and whatever you're gonna do. She doesn't sing that. So she decides she's going to record her own album of the hits from Call Me Madam and the hits from Panama Hattie, totally unrelated. And the original cast album of Call Me Madam was recorded with Dinah Shore. When Ethel Merman gets cast in the movie of Call Me Madam, she acquiesces and they re-record the recording with her actually in the lead spot. But television has a tremendous impact on the Broadway musical at this point in time. In 1953, well, first of all, why? The variety shows of the era, Sid Caesar, Milton Berle, all were live from New York. They relied on the Broadway community talent to fill out the events. So what happens is, in 1953, Jerome Robbins is asked by NBC and CBS together, who are going to host a spectacular event for the Ford Motor Company celebrating the 50 years of American entertainment that the Ford Motor Company has helped to create. Mary Martin is approached and told that she's going to host the special with a guest star, Ethel Merman. Ethel Merman is approached and told she's going to host this special with guest star Mary Martin. And Mary Martin was very afraid of Ethel Merman because Mary Martin got her big break where she was touring in Annie Get Your Gun to better reviews than Ethel Merman had received. And Ethel Merman was a little skittish of Mary Martin because of those reviews. Imagine the Monday morning when they walked into rehearsal and they found out that they had both been duped. What happened was they developed a great, strong mutual respect and admiration. And when someone said to Mayor Ethel Merman, "And what do you think of Mary Martin?" said, "Well, there's nothing wrong with Mary Martin unless you hate people with talent." So this 12-minute duet, when you get home, go on YouTube, search Ethel Merman, Mary Martin, and imagine what it was like in 1953 if you lived out in Kansas or someplace where you never got to see a Broadway musical before, and the two first ladies of the American musical theater were coming into your living room for the first time. It's the only time I can find where the two of them actually were on TV together. The first musical of the era political satire was Ethel Merman in a musical called Call Me Madam. Any of you know this one? Yeah. Well, it was based upon a story of a very fashionable socialite by the name of Pearl Mesta, who was a friend of Harry Truman's, and he makes her the ambassador to Luxembourg, and everybody thinks this is absolutely hysterical. What does a socialite know about being an ambassador? Lindsay and Krauss, who were at the Broadmoor Hotel in Colorado, were reading about this, and they look and they see Ethel Merman is in the pool with her kids. They rush into the hotel, they place a call to Irving Berlin, and they say, "Irving, you're never going to believe this. Ethel Merman's in the pool." And we were reading about Pearl Mesta, and wouldn't it be great if we could write a musical for her about this? And Irving Berlin said, "Go ask her." So they go out and they go, Ethel, you know, look, we were just talking to Irving Berlin. Pearl Mesta was just made the ambassador to Luxembourg. Everybody thinks that's absolutely the craziest idea on earth, and blah, 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 blah. How do you think? Would you do it? She says, "It's great, it's wonderful, it's terrific, but who the hell is Pearl Mesta?" And that is, by the way, a true story. But Guys and Dolls is the first of a group of musicals that are very, very different and unique, and that the language that these people spoke was very different in the time. Later in the cruise, I'm doing a lecture on musicals based upon New York City. I don't want to talk about this one right now because it's so much about New York. I hope you'll allow me to skip past it briefly so that we can come back to it on Sunday morning before we get to New York. Is that okay? Great, okay. But The King and I almost never happened. Gertrude Lawrence, anybody know who she was? Yeah, Gertrude, we talked about her yesterday a little bit. Gertrude Lawrence was this great musical theater star of the British musical theater world. She also was a phenomenon when it came to how she and Noel Coward did things together. She gets into her head that she's seen the movie Anna and the King of Siam. She goes and reads the book, and her agent calls Cole Porter and says, "Gertrude Lawrence would like to have a musical written based upon that book. What do you think?" Cole Porter says, "I don't think so." Well, if you can't get Cole Porter, who's your next best bet? The agent calls Oscar and Dick. And she gets on the Queen Mary, and she comes over to see Rodgers and Hammerstein, who are very polite, but they want nothing to do with her. She has a reputation of eating people for breakfast before she gets out of bed in the morning. She's very, very much a diva. She's very fashionable. She's very chic, but God knows you just don't wish to deal with her. So she decides that this is going to happen, and Rodgers and Hammerstein say, Gertie, look, we write love stories where you have an A couple and a B couple. We like a matriarchal figure. We like some comic relief. We like something that has to do with racism and classism. We don't see anything here in this story about Anna and the King of Siam that does any of that, and Mrs. Anna is certainly not going to become the 35th wife of the king. She says, you're wrong, it's all there, I'm telling you. It's absolutely just like you say you want to write. So I'll tell you what, I'll leave you alone for a week, and before I get back on the Queen to go back, you read it again, and we'll meet, and you tell me if you don't see these things. So sure enough, her determination, they go back, they look at Anna and the King of Siam, they read the music, they read the book again, and they say to her, look, Gertie, it's kind of like this. I agree. I do not think that, you're wrong. We really do see the story of racism and classism because, first of all, this king is worried about the way the British are perceiving this kingdom. What right do the British have to do that? We also think that this Mrs. Anna, although she may not have a real relationship with the king, could become a respected advisor. We also think that the first wife of the king maybe could be elevated to be a go-between between Mrs. Anna and the king. And there's a slave girl that's given to the king in the story by the king of Burma. Perhaps that could be our love story. And maybe what we can do is create a story of such dignity and respect that we see a bond created between Mrs. Anna and the king. That becomes the original thrust of the story. Now let me burst your bubbles. If you think there's anything accurate about the King of Siam and this Mrs. Anna, you are totally wrong. There's two true facts. First fact, Mrs. Anna, we know the king wrote a letter to Abraham Lincoln to ask him if elephants would help fight the American Civil War. Fact. Second fact, Mrs. Anna requested a house outside of the palace. Everything else that is in The King and I is made up, including the fact that Mrs. Anna was a proper British lady. If you see The King and I today in the current revival that's touring, they've gone back to a lot of the original scripts where they point out that she came from Singapore, not from England, that she may or may not, in reality, she may or may not have been married to the father of Louis, her son. She actually may have been Eurasian. They think she was half Indian and half British. And, that's just kind of the beginning. Oh, and by the way, she was nowhere near him when he dies. She was there for 2 years, goes back to England. And if you're looking to wonder, have any of you ever been to Bangkok? If you've been through the palace, there's pictures of this king. He did not dress or look like Yul Brynner. He wore round glasses, he dressed in Western garb, and the people of Thailand eat with knives and forks because this king was educated at Oxford. So, who do you cast? They know they have Gertrude Lawrence, one of the biggest divas you could possibly get. So they go to John Raitt and they said, would you like to play the king? And he came in with such demands that it made Gertrude Lawrence look like a cupcake. They pass on him, and they can't find anybody. They do go to Rex Harrison, by the way, who had made the movie, and his response was, I would love to do this, but I don't sing. And they went to him with a song they had written called A Puzzlement that kind of goes like this. When I was a boy, world was safer spot. What was so, what was not, was not. And he says, but thank you, I still don't sing. Meanwhile, they start looking around, and Mary Martin says, I have this guy I performed in a show with called Lute Song. And the show was terrible, but he's very exotic and very unusual, and he's directing in television. And, you know, he's really a pretty talented guy. Maybe, just maybe, you ought to talk to him. His name is Yul Brynner. So they get in touch with him, and they call him in for an audition. He walks down the aisle of the theater, opens up a guitar, sits down right there center stage, gives the guitar a wallop, and starts to sing some odd Russian folk song, and they cast him on the spot. Meanwhile, as was the custom of the time, music from the musicals quickly got on the radio. And because they had to create a love story, they did it through the stories of others, and they did it through the story of this young slave couple. And this is one of those really beautiful love songs from The King and I. I have dreamed that your arms are lovely. What a joy you'll be. I have dreamed every word you'll whisper when you're close to me. How you look in the glow of evening. I have dreamed and enjoyed the view. In these dreams I've loved you so that by now I think I know what it's like to be loved by you. I will love being loved by you. Thank you very much. So, The King and I opens. It does become a great success, and if it weren't for Gertrude Lawrence, it never would have happened. But shortly after The King and I opens, Gertrude Lawrence starts missing performances. No one can quite figure out why. They figure, oh, Gertie the diva, she has arrived. And sure enough, she collapses one night on stage. She is rushed to the hospital. They discover she has advanced stages of liver cancer, and she dies shortly after. Well, the musical was rather early in its run, and Rodgers and Hammerstein initially start with the understudy, but they figure they better put a name in, and they call in a chit. Celeste Holm, whose career they made, they say to her, we need you to come in to this part until we can figure out what we're going to do with the leading lady. And she agrees. And what happens next is two things. First of all, Gertrude Lawrence insists that Yul Brynner's name go where her name is on that theater placard. That she insists Yul Brynner is the star of the show. I may be gone, but I want him to get the credit he deserves. That happens. Second thing is the dress on the right. There are moments in Broadway musicals that are intensely incredible. And one of them is in The King and I in the second act, when after the British have left, the king wants Mrs. Anna to teach him how to do the polka and show him how she was dancing with the British. And at one point he says to her, no, 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 this is not correct because they're holding hands. And she says, yes, it is. He says, no, it was like this. And he puts his arm around her waist and he grabs her in, and they have this locked gaze where the next thing they do is they continue the dance. And it's one of these monumental moments of American musical theater. Gertrude Lawrence requested, when I die, I want to be buried in that dress. And she was. So the next interesting saga, let me just say a brief story. I meet a lot of interesting people on cruises, and a man came up to me after a lecture, and he said, my mother took me to see The King and I when I was 9 years old. And she grew up in the same town as Yul Brynner in Russia. And when we waited at the stage door, and she said, you'll remember me, I'm so-and-so, and we did this, and we did that, and we lived on this street. He says, madam, I do not know what you're talking about. Why? Remember what I told you about Jerome Robbins and the association with the House Un-American Activities Committee? Yul Brynner was afraid to say he was Russian because who knows what they would have said about him. So he denied all of his background for a very, very long time until he could really then know that it would be safe to do so. It's just kind of interesting. Wonderful Town is another interesting experience I had. On this ship, a woman came up to me and she said, "You are talking about my aunt." "Who's your aunt?" She said, "Rosalind Russell. You got it perfectly nailed. You know everything." So anyway, what I'm about to tell you I know is true. Rosalind Russell's movie career was absolutely over. Her style of acting and performance wasn't really something in the 1950s that was very interesting. She was now in her late 30s, and the idea of Rosalind Russell in a movie did not interest anybody. She's married to a very brilliant British guy whose name is Freddie Brisson. He starts producing, and he gets wind of the fact that Bernstein, Comden, and Green are looking to make a musical out of an old Rosalind Russell movie called My Sister Eileen. Freddie Brisson, being so shrewd, goes to MGM and buys the rights so that suddenly now Leonard Bernstein and Comden and Green are negotiating with Freddie Brisson. Which means, if you're negotiating with Freddie Brisson for a Rosalind Russell movie, guess who you get as the lead? Rosalind Russell. Well, Bernstein wasn't so upset about that because what they know is if you know who you're writing for, it's magical. Rosalind Russell had a 7-note vocal range and the voice of a frog. But they wrote songs that appealed to that kind of a comic voice. They wrote Conga for her. They wrote 100 Ways to Lose a Man. And Rosalind Russell's reviews the day after it opened in the New York Times were, if Rosalind Russell could run for president of the United States right now based upon her performance in Wonderful Town, we would never have to have presidential elections again. And boy, could that have come in handy last year. So in the meantime, there's the story about Rosalind Russell. And I love this picture of her. Look how great she looked. Of course, from here, she goes on the stage to portray Auntie Mame. She makes the movie. She gets another Academy Award nomination. And she and Ethel Merman do a tangle because Rosalind Russell gets the Gypsy movie, at which point Ethel Merman referred to Freddie Brisson as the Lizard of Roz. So, there had only been one other musical about labor relations, and it was written about 15 years prior during the Depression, funded by the WPA, and a theater company controlled by Orson Welles and John Houseman. It was called The Cradle Will Rock, and the FBI thought it would create riots in the streets, so they chained the theater and wouldn't allow it to be performed. Pajama Game is a musical about labor relations. And Hal Prince, who was an assistant stage manager on Call Me Madam at the time, reads this book, is approached by his friend Robert E. Griffin, and they go to Freddie Brisson, and the three of them decide to stage this musical. Now, they thought this was really risky. After all, it's about a strike in a pajama factory in Iowa. And they thought, you know, the last time this happened, who knows? So they do something that was very unusual for 1954 in New York. They opened a musical in May. Now, in the summer in New York, you've all seen The 7-Year Itch, right? Remember what happened? The husbands put the wives on the train to go out to the mountains or the shore or whatever because the city was hot and unbearable. And their thought was, well, if it's a success, everyone will be talking about it all summer long. If it's a flop, they'll forget about it, and they won't talk about it at all. And they were so challenged for money, Hal Prince took the job as stage manager, and Robert E. Griffith took the job as the assistant stage manager because they got this thing produced for $250,000, which, I mean, that was money, but it's not like $20 million today. So one of the things that musicals did at the time was you wanted to make sure that you had hit songs on the radio. Well, like in the story Guys and Dolls, there were 4 hit songs on the radio. King and I, you had 4 hit songs on the radio. Pajama Game had 2 hit songs on the radio. This one was actually recorded was a gimmick song. The idea was the lead character, who's the manager of the plant, John Raitt, is going to sing a duet with himself by dictating it into a dictaphone. That was new technology at the time. Do you remember how dictaphones worked? They were reel-to-reel tapes. Do you remember what used to happen to reel-to-reel tapes? They snagged, they got caught, they broke. So they always had to have somebody in the wings who could sing with him enough to make it be like it was truly John Raitt. Well, does anybody know who recorded it 6 weeks ahead of opening? Rosemary Clooney. And it became a very famous recording of hers, and people really wanted to see this pajama game. It got great reviews. And the other musical song that was on the hit parade was Hernando's Hideaway. But this, of course, is the very famous song that Rosemary Clooney helped make famous. There, you with the stars in your eyes, love never made a fool of you. You used to be too wise. Hey there, you on that high-flying cloud, though she won't throw a crumb to you, you think someday she'll come to you. Better forget her, her with her nose in the air. She has you dancing on a string. Break it and she won't care. Won't you take this advice I hand you like a brother? Or are you not seeing things too clear? Are you just too far gone to hear? Is it all going in one ear and out the other? Thank you so much. Just as an aside, tomorrow we don't charge $450 for the seats down here like they do in New York. So those of you who are buying the cheap seats, you can move down. It's okay. So after Pajama Game, Hal Prince, Robert E. Griffith, and Freddie Brisson decide to stage a musical about baseball. No one had ever done that before. And what was interesting about it was the initial brochure postings were Gwen Verdon in a baseball uniform. And nobody was buying tickets because the wives usually made the decisions. Well, then they changed the poster to this, and everybody, all the men, wanted to go see Damn Yankees. And of course, this too had pop songs on the radio. You've got to have heart, all you really need is heart. Same formula. It was really pretty phenomenal. But then we get to masterpiece time. And what's interesting about My Fair Lady is that, quite frankly, it truly is a masterpiece that nobody thought could get made. Everybody had tried to make a musical out of Pygmalion, Rodgers and Hammerstein, and MGM was trying to negotiate with the Shaw estate. When Lerner and Loewe went to the estate and said, before you make a decision to make it into a movie, please let us work on this for 6 weeks first on spec. They went back to the 1937 movie with Wendy Hiller and Leslie Howard. And they heard about all kinds of things that happen off stage that you never see, like when Eliza's taken to a tea. They changed that to she's taken to the Ascot races, all kinds of different things with Alfred P. Doolittle, and My Fair Lady becomes a modern masterpiece. What's interesting is they cast Rex Harrison, who, remember, said he couldn't sing. Lerner and Loewe then convinced him that if he had only taken the part in The King and I, he'd be Yul Brynner that day, but that's okay. And they cast Julie Andrews, and Julie Andrews was very young, immature in her acting skills, and Rex Harrison was about to quit because of her. And Moss Hart, who's directing it, says to his wife, Kitty Carlisle, what do I do with her? She's cardboard. I can't. He says, well, what would you do in the old days, Moss? And he says, well, I would have taken her to a hotel, locked her in a room, and pasted the part onto her. And Kitty Carlisle said, well, you know what, Moss, maybe you need to do that now. He tells Julie, and Rex Harrison, Thursday afternoon, before this event happens, says to him, if you can't get her any better, by next Wednesday, I quit. Moss Hart gets a suite at the Essex House. He pastes the part on her, when to lift an elbow, when to smile, when to turn over, when to, whatever. And by Monday morning, she comes in, and she is now rising to the task. Now, Julie Andrews says Rex Harrison truly was very patient with her, and he was renowned for having affairs with all of his leading ladies. And she says, I don't know if he was making a pass at me or not. I was so concentrating on all of my acting that I needed to do. Who knows if he was trying to make a pass at me? Well, the funny thing was, Rex Harrison, I think, got really annoyed because he was constantly trying to upstage her. And when she was singing, he'd say, sing it flat, you wench. But they became good friends. She had a great deal of respect for him as he did for her. So, My Fair Lady, we all know. And what's also interesting about My Fair Lady, later in the cruise, I think I'm doing a lecture on the British influence of the Broadway musical. This was an American piece, but our fascination with everything that was British really sort of ties into this in the 1950s. Candide, Leonard Bernstein's attempt to create, Leonard Bernstein was pretty left-wing himself, and this was in the middle of the Cold War, and they wanted to take the stories of Voltaire, and this was the commentary on the communist societies and what they were doing to the people they governed in Europe, with Lillian Hellman writing the script. Tyrone Guthrie, the great director who had never directed a musical, signs on to do this. And what they created was a great big muddle of a mess with magnificent music. It takes 15 years for Candide to achieve a success, and when it was rewritten by Hal Prince with Stephen Sondheim and Hugh Wheeler in the 1970s. The Most Happy Fella. Anybody ever watch I Love Lucy? Okay. Most Happy Fella opened right around the same time as My Fair Lady, and one of the problems with it was that My Fair Lady was what everybody wanted to see. So if you're a writer of a musical, pick your partners well, and they picked Desi Arnaz and Lucille Ball to invest in this musical. If you know I Love Lucy, there is an episode where Lucy and Ricky go to the theater, and they come for the evening performance only to find out that their tickets were for the matinee, and they don't have 4 seats, there's only 2 seats. And while all this is going on, you hear standing on the corner, watching all the girls go by, and 3 other pieces of music from The Most Happy Fella. The impact of television on that was that The Most Happy Fella ran for 3 years. The Music Man, of course, everybody's wonderfully favorite musical, starring Robert Preston and Barbara Cook, about life growing up in Iowa. But let me ask you this. I'm going to skip Bells Are Ringing for a minute. West Side Story, Music Man. Who won the Tony for Best Musical? Music Man. By 1 vote. West Side Story was actually not everybody's favorite. It was considered way, way, way too violent. It was considered way, way, way too emotional. And West Side Story had an interesting saga. It was originally thought of by Jerome Robbins. He wanted to do a musical based upon Romeo and Juliet. It was going to be called East Side Story, the story of a Jewish boy and a Catholic girl over the Passover Easter weekend. And as they started writing this, they thought they were writing Abe's Irish Rose again and decided nobody would care. Jerome Robbins comes in with an article from the New York Post about gang killings in a part of Manhattan where Lincoln Center now sits, and he decides, my gosh, maybe we shift this to that neighborhood with a Puerto Rican gang and a white uneducated high school dropout gang, and we make that the story. And he decided West Side Story should be about the gangs. And it was very unique in its creation because West Side Story named every single person in the gangs and also made sure that that the story would be told by dance. When I told you Jerome Robbins was kind of hideous, do you see his name right here? 2 weeks before it opens in Washington, he goes to Hal Prince and says, if you don't put my name in a box and give me 3 extra percentage points of ownership, the play's over. He writes into the script certain things that have to happen if you do a professional production of West Side Story, and none of his partners were aware of this until they saw the placard go up in Washington a week before it opened. And of course, these are the magnificent moments of West Side Story. West Side Story did not become iconic until 1962 when the movie was made, and United Artists spent $1 million promoting the music. To let you know how important that was, the reviews of West Side Story in 1957 were hyperactive, blaring, relentlessly driven music that never stops. Hardly what we all think of when we think of West Side Story. Flower Drum Song. You notice we haven't talked about Rodgers and Hammerstein much. They have 6 years of one disaster after another. They try again with Exotic. They write the Flower Drum Song. But Gypsy and Sound of Music are now in the same year. Just as a point of trivia, who won the best musical? Gypsy or Sound of Music? Sound of Music. Which one is the better musical today? Gypsy. Merman had had a disaster of a musical right before this called Happy Hunting. And I don't really have time to go into the story. It's a really pretty funny one. Catch me one day up at lunch or walking around. I'll tell you the story of Merman and Happy Hunting. And Jerome Robbins reads the biography of Gypsy Rose Lee, goes to Arthur Lawrence, the playwright, and they decide that this could really be a musical. Stephen Sondheim signs on to write the words and the music, only to have Ethel Merman say, he's never written a musical before. I've just been through that. I want Julie Stein, and the kid can write the words that come out of my mouth. He writes great words, and he did. Once I was a schlepper, now I'm Miss Mazeppa is one of my very favorite lyrics of all time. But in any event, they write that the part of a lifetime for Ethel Merman. It's the Lady Macbeth of the Broadway musical, this woman who would sell her soul to create a dominating scene for her children to be stars in a musical. Absolutely incredible. And what really then happens is Ethel Merman had an acting style where she delivered everything front and center. Jack Klugman was cast as Herbie, and she's giving him a cue one day in rehearsal, and he doesn't answer. And she says to him, "Where were you?" And he says, "Excuse me, were you talking to me?" She storms off stage. She comes back on. She says, "Okay, give me the line again." He gives her the line, and she actually turned to talk to him, and that was the first time she ever interacted with somebody on stage. Any event, so who wins the Best Actress Award? Ethel Merman or Mary Martin? Mary Martin. And when Ethel Merman was asked about that, you know what she quipped? Well, how do you win and beat a nun? Sound of Music was an idea. Mary Martin hadn't been on Broadway for 6 years. Her husband locates the book created by Maria von Trapp. They pay her something less than $5,000 and 0.25% for the story. The book was written by Lindsay and Krause because Oscar really wasn't well enough. And when they're in tryouts, they have hired now, by the way, Theodore Bickel to play Captain Von Trapp. He's 30 years old, a renowned folk singer. Mary Martin is 47. Connect the dots. Meanwhile, Sound of Music, there isn't too much accurate in that either. And if you think they climbed over any mountains to get anywhere, they actually got on a train and went to Italy. So I hate to burst your bubble about that as well. But when they were in Boston, they realized that Captain Von Trapp had nothing to do, and Theodore Bickel was getting a little angst-ridden, beside the fact he was supposed to be older than Mary Martin, and Mary Martin was old enough to be his mother. And they get together, and they write one song for Captain Von Trapp. It's the last song Rodgers and Hammerstein ever wrote, and I please invite you all to sing along with me because you're going to know exactly what this is. Edelweiss, every morning you greet me, small and white, clean and bright, you look happy to me. blossom of snow, may you bloom and grow forever. Edelweiss, Edelweiss, bless my homeland forever. Blossom of snow, may you bloom and grow forever. Edelweiss, Edelweiss, bless my homeland forever. Thank you. Anybody have any questions you'd like to ask? Do I see any hands going? Oh, yeah, way back up there, red shirt. Well, Janis Paige in the era, if you listen to the original cast recording, it was what the sound was that they wanted. It worked, at a level. Obviously, Doris Day made the movie, but they thought she was just perfect for the part. Who knows what the thinking was at the time? I've never asked Hal Prince that question. I may one day if I meet him. Anybody else have a question you'd like to ask? Yeah. Milk and Honey's in the 60s. We haven't gotten to it yet. I'm probably 1962. I'm not going to talk about it really because I just don't have time. It was Jerry Herman's first Broadway musical. It starred Molly Pecan from the Yiddish Theater in a small part. Anybody? I saw somebody else. Yes. Larry Hart. After Pal Joey and I believe it's even after Oklahoma. They revive a musical they wrote called A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, and Larry Hart was so alcoholic at the time that on the opening night, Richard Rodgers had to eject him from the theater, and he roams the streets for 2 days in a drunken stupor where he collapses and dies. Yes. Oscar Hammerstein dies right after The Sound of Music opened. He had stomach cancer, and he was really having a very difficult time. And one of the reasons he didn't write the script of Sound of Music is because he just wasn't well enough to do that. He wrote the lyrics, but not the... And if you know the script of the Sound of Music play, it doesn't quite work the way it might have had Oscar actually written it. And by the way, the musical got disastrous reviews. They didn't like it at all when it opened. They thought it was a sweet, gooey mess. Yes, question. Yes. Yes, you can. With Robert Alda, Vivian Blaine, and Stubby Kaye, and Sam Levine. And it is available if you go on Amazon. It looks like one of the pictures I put up. So yes, it is absolutely available. I will tell you the recording I like better is the 1992 revival with Nathan Lane and Faith Prince. I mean, they're both really good, but the 1992 revival includes a lot of music that's not on that 1951 version. Oh, I hope not. Actually, the movie, Frank Lesser liked it. The movie, they took music out and added music for Frank Sinatra. And one of the reasons Sam Levine's character, Nathan Detroit, doesn't sing more is he was tone deaf and they couldn't get him to hear anything. So yeah. So by the way, I'm on Channel 7, I understand, if you wish to do that. Tomorrow we're going to pick up right here again and talk about the 1960s. And I understand my book's sold out. I'm going to be bringing more on board in Boston. So if anybody wants one, just kind of hold your excitement for that moment when they arrive, you know. And one other thing. There are shows that play on Sunday night in New York. I recommend, if you want to do it, go onto playbill.com and search specials and see what's playing on Sunday night, because sometimes there are discount tickets for things. If you haven't seen Beautiful, I Would Do It. Book of Mormon plays on Sunday night. There's a new production of the play M. Butterfly that plays on Sunday night. Cats plays on Sunday night. So and if you're wondering what to do, and if you're interested in knowing where you might want to go eat near the theaters, find me. I'll guide you. I'll be very happy to give anybody any advice they want on what they should go see or not go see. And I think Phantom of the Opera, if you've never had that experience, may play on Sunday nights as well, and you can be there with all the Japanese tourists. So, so thank you very much. It's been great, and I'll see you all tomorrow.